The gospel lesson this morning is from the gospel according to St. Matthew, the 16th chapter, the 21st through the 28th verses. You remember that in last week's passage, Peter has declared Jesus Messiah. And now Jesus explains to them what that means. Not only for his disciples then, but also for his disciples now. Listen carefully to these words from Matthew's gospel. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up the cross, and follow me. For those who will save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with the angels in the glory of the Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here today who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. This is the word of the Lord. Amen. It was just a few weeks ago when a madman, an extremist of the dangerous kind, if there is another kind of extremist, decided to make his convoluted point by bombing buildings in Oslo and then by heading out to a pristine island and gunning down children and youth. In the wake of his insanity, 76 lives were gone, snuffed out, ended. And the world waited to see how folks would respond. And everyone was left wondering what on earth was the point that Anders Breivik was trying to make by these actions. How does one believe that you make a statement about evil in the world by perpetrating more evil in the world? The pundits began responding. They were on radio and on TV, on Facebook, tweeting together. Everyone was shocked by what had taken place, and many began to venture how it was that Norway ought to respond to what had happened. And so we waited after the pundits were finished with all their talking to see what actually would occur and who was right and who was wrong. They took to the streets. Hundreds of thousands of Norwegians took to the streets of Oslo, and they held hands, and they laid flowers down to commemorate the memories of those whose lives had been lost. This mass of humanity gathered together in the streets to mourn, to grieve, to hold each other up by their mutual support, hoping that something might address their pain. And they waited to see how their leaders would respond. The crown prince took the lead. His wife's stepbrother had been killed in the massacre. And yet he stood before this mass of folks and he said, "Tonight, these streets are filled with love. We have chosen to meet hatred with unity." Then Prime Minister Stoltenberg spoke, and he said, "With roses and with candles, we send the world a message that fear will not break us." And the crowd cheered so loudly that his words were hard to hear. And finally, Oslo Mayor Fabian Stang took to the microphone. And he inspired the crowd with the eloquence of these words. "We will come together to punish the killer. Our punishment will be more generosity, more tolerance, and more democracy." Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good, repay no evil for evil. Take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. What marvelous words. Surely they provide the subtext for those words that were spoken as the crowds gathered in Oslo that night. One wonders what the world might look like, what the world might feel like, what the world might be like if these really were the words by which we governed our behavior toward one another. What difference would it make? Oh, preacher, what kind of crazy idealism is that? It's the crazy idealism of the call of Jesus Christ. It is the crazy idealism of the words of the Apostle Paul. That kind of crazy idealism. Paul's words are marvelous. They are poetic. Every word. My, what a preacher's delight to look at that passage. Only problem is you've got to decide what you can preach about and what you have to leave out because there's too much there. He wraps it all up, all these wonderful aspirations of how Christians might behave toward one another. Paul has been writing for the first 11 chapters in Romans to convince folks that the grace of God, this marvelous grace that is ours by no doing of our own, is not only for the Jews but for the Gentiles alike. This grace is for everybody. And with the marvelous words that only Paul can pen, he's made that point clear. This grace that you have received, know that it is yours. But then he switches gears. Now the question becomes quite simply, since we have been saved by grace, what now? What consequences does that have for the living of our lives? Since we have been saved by grace, how then shall we live? That's the question Paul is asking. And the answer is really fairly simple. since God responds to our sin, to our evil, with grace, then we too are to respond to the world's evil with grace. That's what he says. We are to follow God's lead. We are to do the same. We are not to respond to the evil in this world with more evil of our own. We are to respond the way God has responded, in love, genuine love. Genuine love. That's what grace is all about. The response to grace is more grace. That's what he says. But let's be honest, it's not an easy response to make. Our gut says respond in kind, get even, hit back. God's call is for us to respond in grace, and indeed it is a difficult task. Frank Stagg says that this is the paradox of faith. On the one hand, grace is free and costs us nothing. On the other hand, it costs us everything. To respond in grace is to live the faith as God has called us to live. And often that requires more than we realized we were asked to give. You remember a few short years ago that another madman showed up in an Amish schoolhouse in Pennsylvania. And before he was done, 10 of their Amish daughters were dead at his hand. And the world was aghast to think that that could happen in an Amish community of all places. We were aghast.